Never sleep in your car on a road trip. I'm from Connecticut. I was in a long-distance relationship with a girl from Georgia and would often make road trips down to visit her. I don't really mind. I love road trips. I've driven across the United States and back all on my own. There's just something about traveling the highways of the US by yourself that's just so freeing. To save money, I would sleep in my car. It's not so bad. It's basically camping in a metal tent. It makes you feel like you're really roughing it. I just recline the seat back, keep the key in the ignition just in case, and doze off. No, I don't put anything up to block the windows for privacy. Maybe I should have. The trip down south is a comfortable 2-day drive. My stop would usually be somewhere along the Virginia-North Carolina border. So for my previous trip, that's exactly where I stopped that night. Rest stops were often less trafficked and thus quieter than truck stops. Normally, I would have stopped at a Love's, but I was so tired that I settled for the first rest stop I saw. It was oddly vacant that night, with only a couple lone cars sitting forlorn under the amber street lamps, most likely travelers with the same idea as myself. I pulled into a parking spot away from the others, under the shadow of a tree and far from the street lamps. I figured I would have more privacy there as opposed to being bathed in light. So I did my usual thing. I locked the doors, opened the windows just a hair for ventilation, kept my key in, reclined the seat, and went to sleep. I was never interrupted on any of these car camping nights before, so I never suspected anything on this one. Suddenly, a sharp tap woke me up. At first, I thought I had heard it in my dream. I opened my eyes a bit, confused. Since I leaned back to sleep, I was facing the ceiling and couldn't see anything. I heard another tap, like a tiny object hitting a hard surface. It came in an irregular rhythm. Was it raining? Was water dripping onto my windshield? I was under a tree. Maybe something fell from the branches. Maybe a squirrel or a bird dropped something. What if a squirrel was climbing around my car? Or what if it wasn't an animal? The thought occurred to me that it might very well be a person poking around outside. What did they want? Were the doors locked? Yes, the keys were in the ignition. I can leave in an instant. Still, I lay there, completely still, pretending to be asleep. Pretending I hadn't heard anything. Hoping, whoever it was, they would just leave me alone. It was better not to find out. I was too afraid to find out. It was better to stay there in blissful ignorance. Still, the tapping continued. I had to do something. There was no way I was just going to stay there. I had to look. My heart was pounding. At that moment, it was deafeningly loud. Whoever was out there could probably hear it. I decided I was going to look. I was going to raise my head up and see what was making the noise. So that's what I did. What met my eyes sent a jolt through my entire body, every muscle fiber locked up in pure shock at what I saw. The faint glow of the street lamps cast just enough light for me to make out what I was looking at. There, in the windshield, staring directly at me, was a face. Someone, I presumed to be a woman, was lying on my hood, her head pressed right up against my windshield. Her face was completely still, locked in a permanent grin. I froze in overwhelming terror. The eyes I stared into appeared to have rolled back, showing only the whites. The nose was turned up, pressed painfully into the glass. The lips stretched wide, revealing horrid rotten teeth. Even in the darkness, I could tell her skin was sickly pale, contrasting her long, filthy black hair. Whoever this was, she was clearly not in her right mind. I don't know how long I sat there, too afraid to move. Finally, I got a grip on myself, and my hand shot to the ignition. It turned over, making, in that instant, the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. For a split second, I was afraid I might be caught in a horror movie scenario, the one where the car won't crank as the killer approaches. I reversed as fast as I could, trying not to give this creeper time to try anything. In my panic, I remember activating the windshield wipers in a futile attempt to get her off. Was I about to drive out of here with some wacko holding onto my hood, I thought? Thankfully, I didn't have to worry about that, because as soon as I stopped, the woman leapt off, landing on all fours. Seeing my opportunity, I shifted into drive and gunned it, right as I saw her reaching for my driver's side door. With my foot on the gas, I sped out of the parking lot. Behind me, I heard her let out a piercing shriek like that of an animal. I looked in my rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw her chasing me, running on all fours, her black hair swinging wildly around her. I couldn't get a good look as I rounded a curve in the road leading out of the rest stop and merged with the highway. There, I picked up speed and drove through the night. I did not dare stop again until I saw the morning light. The Visitor. As a young kid, I was always super optimistic. I always found the good in people, and my mom would sometimes get annoyed. When we went to stores, I would always run into strangers and ask, "How was your day?" or "How can I help you?" My mom would come from behind me, take my hand, and apologize for me disturbing them. She told me that I can't always trust people. I wish I had believed her. I was 8 years old one night when I woke up. I wasn't scared of the dark, but I wouldn't lie if I said a random thud didn't startle me. I flipped the light switch right next to my bed, revealing a woman in my room. It scared me, and as I had no idea who she was, I almost began to scream before she covered my mouth. She put a finger over her lips. Despite being afraid, I looked at her. She couldn't have been older than 16 and was really pretty. She removed her hand from my mouth, and I couldn't help but feel she was a friend. I mean, if she wanted to hurt me, she could have. I asked, "Who are you?" She quietly answers, "My name is Hannah." We talked for a little, and she asked how old I was, where I went to school, and about my mom. After a while, I wondered if I could show her my Lego set, to which she smiled and said, "Of course." She even offered me some of her Pepsi, which tasted a little funny, but it was still excellent. I started to really like her and enjoyed her company. After a while, she looked at her watch and stared at it. As she did, a tear fell down her face. I asked her, "Hannah, are you okay?" She wiped her tear and said no. I felt terrible for her. She then asked if I wanted ice cream, to which I'm always down for ice cream. She took my hand and led me to what I thought would be the kitchen. But instead, she walked me to my front door, and before she opened the door, she asked me something weird. "Why didn't you freak out when I appeared in your room?" Even at a young age, I understood that to be a weird question. I thought and said, "I just trust you." Another tear came down her face, and then she said something I couldn't forget. She said, "I can't do this anymore." She locked the door, which I realized wasn't locked. Then she took me to the kitchen where she grabbed a knife. I didn't know what was happening. She then took me to my mom's room, where she told me to go and tell her that a man outside was trying to break in and to call the cops. I didn't understand what she was asking, but she looked into my eyes. "You're a brave kid. I need you to be a little bit braver." She kissed me on the cheek, which made me blush. I trusted her and went to my mom's room. I tugged on her and she woke up. She looked at me and said, "Hey, sweetheart, did you have a bad dream?" I looked at her severely. "Mom, there is a man outside, and I think he wants to hurt Hannah. You need to call the police." What I said startled her, and she got out of bed. "Honey, I think you had a bad nightmare." I looked at her more seriously and began explaining about Hannah being in my room and how she told me to come in here and to ask her to call the police. The look on her face filled with fear when I told her that Hannah had locked the door. My mom ran to her door and locked it, turning on the light. The light blinded me for a second, and when I opened my eyes, my mom had her gun out and was on her phone. She sat on the bed, and that's when the sound of someone banging on the front door started. I jumped into bed and saw on my mom's phone that she was looking at the camera at the front door. I began to become really scared. "Mom, what is happening?" She said to stay there. She gave me the phone and told me to call 911. "When I leave this room, lock the door and do not unlock it for anyone but me." She then looked at me so intensely that it scared me and asked, "Did you understand?" I nodded my head. She then unlocked her door and left when I shut and locked it. I began calling 911 and started to provide my address when the banging increased. As I gave as much information to the dispatcher as I could, I began to hear screaming. Then the door sounded as if it had knocked off its hinge, and more screams followed. Eventually, a gunshot emerged. I tried hard to stay on the line, but I started to feel really tired and weak, and as I closed my eyes, everything faded. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. I looked for my mom, but she wasn't there. Instead, there was a police officer. He noticed I was awake and began calming me down. He asked me to tell him what I remembered, and I started explaining everything I could. After I did, he thanked me for my time and left, and right after, my mom entered. She kissed me on my forehead. I asked her what had happened, and she said she would explain more as I got older. But for now, she explained a bad man was trying to hurt my friend Hannah, and she stopped him. I learned that I passed out for 3 days. Even weirder, after I got out of the hospital, I learned that Hannah would come to live with us for the time being. It was nice having her around. She became an older sister to me and helped my mom out. I could tell Hannah had a hard time as she had more nightmares than I did and had to see many doctors. After a year, I finally asked my mom what had happened that night, and she refused to tell me. So I went to Hannah. What she said scared me and made me feel happy that she was my friend that night. She said my mom shot at him when the evil man entered the house, but missed, and he stabbed her. When he started to head to the room I was in, Hannah attacked him and stopped him. She then helped my mom when the police arrived on the scene. When she looked down, I asked why I fell asleep. She said, "I spiked your drink and was initially helping the man who was trying to kidnap you." My waking nightmare. I've struggled with sleep paralysis ever since I was a little kid. The first time it happened was when I was 7, and I woke up at my brother's in my bedroom, unable to move. It's hard to describe just how terrifying the experience is unless you've experienced it yourself. Still, to this day, I consider it the most frightening psychological experience I have ever dealt with. Not only am I unable to move, but of course it usually happens when I've just woken up from a nightmare, and oftentimes it still feels like I'm in the nightmare. That night, when I was 7, I woke up and immediately noticed I could not move. I tried to will my limbs to move, but they simply wouldn't. I looked around the room to see if I could find anything that would help wake me up, and that's when I noticed the pile of dirty clothes in the armchair in the corner. Only, it wasn't just a pile of clothes. At least, it didn't look like just a pile of clothes. Because of how they were positioned with a pair of pants hanging down to the floor, a lumpy middle part that looked like a stomach, and a smaller bundle on top, it looked like a short man was sitting in the chair staring at me. I told myself it was just a bad dream, and that I just needed to go back to sleep. Only that was when the head moved. The small bundle of clothes on the top moved ever so slightly towards the ceiling, as if the sitting man was craning his neck to get a better look at me. I wanted to scream, but as hard as I tried, my vocal cords simply couldn't do it. The man seemed to notice this, because as I continued to stare at him, sweating in terror but unable to move, the form stood up from the chair and began to walk toward my bed. It was like watching a cartoon, this caricature of a person made of clothes walking toward me. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced, and I felt utterly trapped. He came closer. Eventually, he reached the foot of my bed, and that's when I noticed the eyes. Where it was just a lifeless bundle of clothes seconds earlier, there were now 2 red eyes that began to glow where the head was. Every nerve in my body felt like it was on fire, and I began to wet the bed. I honestly thought he was going to kill me. My mind racing in terror, the man made his way around the mattress so he could come face to face with me. I wanted so desperately to scream so my brother would wake up and attack the man, but again my body simply wouldn't allow me to scream. Instead, I forced all of my energy into my fingers to try and wiggle them. His arm, made of a hoodie sleeve, made its way toward my throat. My heart pounded as I tried to prevent him from strangling me, and that's when I felt my fingers start to vibrate. He was grabbing my throat now, applying pressure so strong that I began to be unable to breathe. I continued willing my fingers to do something, anything, as I tried to fight for my life. In a jolt, my arm whipped up toward the neck and threw away the sleeve. I propelled out of my bed, screaming louder and more forcefully than ever, instantly waking my brother and parents up, who all came running to ask me what had happened. When I tried to explain what had happened, everyone looked at me like I was a sick animal. "Oh, you poor thing." To my dismay, the pile of clothes was precisely where it was at the beginning of the night, in the chair. Now, 20 years later, I'm as happy as I could be. I have a good job, I came out and got married to my husband, and overall have a healthy and fulfilled life. Every once in a while, though, especially if I've been stressed out from work, I'll have another nightmare and wake up in a state of sleep paralysis. My therapist has taught me techniques that usually work pretty well, like meditating or trying to make tiny movements like wiggling my fingers or toes until I can either wake up or fall back asleep. Honestly, though, the nightmares have become more frequent ever since Darren Miller showed up on the news. We live in a mid-sized city, so crime certainly happens. Still, it's usually your average stuff like burglaries and break-ins. Nothing like serial killers. That is, not until Darren Miller was arrested on November 7th. A tall, muscular ginger in his 40s, with a beard and Harry Potter-style glasses, he was charged with 38 counts of first-degree murder, along with a slew of other charges after the authorities found a torture chamber in his basement and the bodies of 38 men buried in his yard. He would often break into the homes of couples while they were sleeping, make his way to their bedroom, and bash their heads in, or even decapitate them with an axe. The killings wrecked our community, and my husband and I were devastated by the loss of these innocent couples. On the night he was arrested, we attended a vigil downtown with our friends. Eventually, he was transferred to the high-security Langston County Psychiatric Institute while he awaited trial. Over the course of a few months after he was arrested, my nightmares became more and more frequent. I felt terrible for waking my husband up so much after I screamed myself awake, so eventually I started sleeping in the guest room. One February day, I had a particularly rough time at work. I knew I would probably have another sleep paralysis episode again, so before bed, I took a hefty dose of Xanax, hoping it would knock me out. As luck would have it, this of course didn't happen. As I lay blissfully asleep, I was instantly jolted awake by a piercing scream of agony from my husband and I's room, along with what sounded like a wet, crunching noise. I immediately tried to get up and run to the bedroom, but my body was stuck. I was lying on my back with my head propped up on a pillow facing the door. I stared at the cracked open doorway, my heart racing as I tried so desperately to figure out what was wrong and wanted to run to my husband. After a few seconds, though, I was met with an uncomfortable silence. There was no screaming anymore. All I could hear was the tree branches scraping the window from the wind outside. However, there was quickly followed by slow, thudding footsteps from the pitch-black hallway. I began to sweat, a small whimper coming from my throat as I felt my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and that's when I noticed the sound of the footsteps right outside the door as it began to slowly open. A dark hand wrapped its fingers around the door, and the foot of a boot made its way onto the plush carpet. The door was slowly opened completely, its rusted hinge making a screeching noise as a tall figure with an axe entered the room. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I tried to begin meditating and moving my fingers, telling myself that this was just a dream, but that thought was instantly washed away when the moonlight shone on Darren Miller's face. I knew it was him from his round glasses, ginger beard, and the bloody axe at his side staining the carpet. A cold chill made its way down my spine, and every nerve in my body fighting like heck trying to wake me up, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at the man before me, slowly making his way toward my bed. As I watched him approach the foot of my bed, blood trickling on the floor, I knew why I had heard my husband screaming moments earlier, but I couldn't admit it to myself. Darren was locked in a psychiatric institute. This simply couldn't be possible. But as I tried to reassure myself that this was just a dream, he inched closer and closer to my face, his axe now suspended over the bed, dripping hot, sticky blood onto my chest. There was no way this was just a dream. Darren silently stared at me, his face completely expressionless. For a moment, it almost looked like he didn't have eyes. All I saw were two black holes looking at me, ready to kill. I forced all of my energy into trying to wiggle my fingers. I had to wake up and stop him, do everything I could to save myself. He began to swing the axe behind his shoulder, preparing to strike. I saw my life flash before my eyes, and desperately wished to see my husband again. I couldn't believe we were about to be Darren Miller's next victims. At that moment, the axe mere seconds away from chopping my head off, my fingers began to tingle, and I was able to move my pointer finger. An instant later, I finally snapped out of it and extended my arm just as the axe was a foot from my throat, stopping Darren from slicing my flesh. With all the force I could muster, I reached my other arm onto the axe, stood up, and pushed it to the floor. I screamed and shoved Darren away, instantly running to my husband, preparing for the bloody scene I would see before me. Instead, I was met with my husband getting out of bed and running toward me to ask what was wrong. I first asked him how the heck he was alive, seeing as I had just heard him get brutally killed with an axe while I lay paralyzed in the guest bedroom. He looked at me like I had just spoken Greek to him. I grabbed his arm and ran back to the guest room with him, telling him we needed to call the police because Darren Miller was in our house. When we entered the guest room, we were met with the cat sleeping soundly in an armchair. The bed covers had been thrown around, but nothing was out of the ordinary. No Darren, no axe, no bloodstains on the carpet. My husband began trying to soothe me, reassuring me that it was just a nightmare, but I couldn't accept that. Mere moments ago, I stopped a crazy serial killer from decapitating me, his expressionless face staring at me. Reluctantly, we returned to our room, and my husband went back to sleep. I sat up all night, staring at the doorway. The next day, I made an emergency appointment with my therapist, and understandably wanted to have my dose of Xanax increased. I sat in her waiting room, filling out some paperwork, as an emergency broadcast came on the news. Last night, a storm went right over the Langston County Psychiatric Institute, causing a power outage. Their generators were apparently severely outdated and didn't kick on, causing the security doors to become unlocked. The main reason for the broadcast, though, was to alert the community about multiple inmates who had escaped. The most important one they wanted to alert the city to, the one whose face, with its round glasses and ginger beard, was plastered on the screen, was him, Darren Miller.